I've asked Noah if he could be a keynote for the last couple of years, but he's always had scheduling conflicts. So third time's a charm.
Third time's a charm. Glad to be here, and I think this is a much bigger audience than what you promised the last few years. So
yes,
it's a little more intimidating now, I'll be honest.
Well, I think Slack has grown probably by the same proportion over the last
about
years.
3 to 4x in size the last couple of years. So,
that's right.
Yeah.
So we're here together.
Yeah.
So for those of you who don't know Noah, I'll give you his quick background. He, like our other keynote earlier today in Carolyn, is a New Yorker. This guy over here, probably has the ideal PM resume. He went to Stanford and studied human-computer interaction, the PM undergrad degree. From there, he went to Google as a PM for a couple of years. Then he went over to Foursquare, one of New York's premier startups, where he ultimately was SVP of product management. And then from there, you've gone over to Slack, where you're a senior director, and you've worked a number of things, including machine learning. So this is a PM resume for us all to aspire to. I want to be like you when I grow up.
This is far more embarrassing than you described ahead of time, but I appreciate it. I don't think there's any singular kind of path that people take, so that's just one of them.
Well, I'm guessing product strategy was an important part of that journey.
Yep.
So you work at Slack. Just give us the quick 2-sentence, what is Slack, for those of us who aren't familiar?
Sure. Well, let's do the inverse. Raise your hand if you don't use Slack at work. Okay. Well, our sales team will be disappointed with me showing up to this event, but it looked like maybe 5%. For those 12 people in the room, Slack is a collaboration hub for teams that helps you pull the people that you care about and all the applications that you care about together in one place. It's something that started about almost 5 years ago now. It came out of a kind of failed gaming company that pivoted into a enterprise software company, which is a very typical path. The team here in New York is really focused. So we started this team about 2.5 years ago. We were based out of a coffee shop, then a WeWork, and then finally have our own place. It's about 100 folks now. Pretty much about 2/3 sales, 1/3 product development. And the team here is focused really on applying kind of consumer-grade techniques from search and machine learning to the enterprise to help companies become more productive. So it's a quick high level.
And what have you been focusing on personally at your time at Slack?
Yeah, so we kind of started the team here. Stuart, the CEO and founder, and I spent a bunch of time kind of figuring out, all right, what's the kind of next evolution for Slack after it kind of figures out how to get all these people, all these tools kind of all flowing together in one place through channels. And one of the kind of almost obvious things in retrospect was, well, there should be a punchline to that. It's not just about awareness and not just about collaboration, but also about how to make people dramatically more productive because you have all this history together. So what we've been really focused on is, one, using search so that you could be able to access your company's kind of collective knowledge all together in one place. And then the other half has really been the proactive side. So how do we get you to be able to focus on what's most important, catch up quickly when you first start using Slack, and hopefully tame that feeling of information overload that, frankly, Slack obviously can engender a little bit. So really kind of using those two kind of consumer pain points as areas of focus to apply a lot of the techniques that we'll talk about today.
I think actually one of the panelists earlier today said that Slack can be a little overwhelming with so much content coming at you.
Yeah, that's a fair charge for sure.
So the topic today is actually machine learning. It's a top topic for you guys in the community to learn about this year as we think about product strategy. And I thought that a marvelous representative of that for the New York community would be Noah. Noah, in your words, what is machine learning? I've heard so many words: AI, computer vision, blah blah blah. What is machine learning?
It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. To that point, I think at kind of high level, the way I look at it is training machines to use examples from history to make predictions about an uncertain future. And there's a couple pieces there, I guess. One is obviously training from history. So as we'll kind of get into, I think figuring out as a product person, how do you actually get, whether it's data sources that live outside your product or data kind of cycles that you can create within your product to actually give your team something to train off against, so a historical example. Then it's making predictions, so how accurate can you actually predict something that someone might want or an outcome that you think might happen. And then dealing with uncertainty, because you'll be wrong a lot. So I think versus a lot of types of product development from just more of a PM lens, normally you're like, oh, here's the spec and it's going to do exactly this thing. When you hit the cancel button, the window closes. That's completely deterministic. I think from dealing with more data-driven products, you have to deal with the fact that you'll be wrong some of the time. You'll present something that's inaccurate, and how do you build in, kind of the affordances in the product to be a little bit more forgiving? So that's a little bit more of a PM lens, but I think that's how you can think about ML broadly.
Yes. And what are some of your favorite examples in real life that we all might understand of either machine learning that's been good or not so good?
Yeah. I always want to come up with like more novel examples, but my examples are super basic because I'm just a normal consumer in this world. I have pretty mediocre taste in music, but I feel like Spotify has made me just a little bit more in the know. Are there any Spotify folks here? Maybe? No? Well, anyway, if they were here, I'd really commend them on Discover Weekly. I think for those of you who don't use it, it's basically kind of using your listening history to be able to recommend to you it's like a weekly playlist of songs that you've never heard before that you might like. And for me, it's kind of been this perfect way of actually discovering music that otherwise I'd be far not cool enough to ever find myself. And to do it in a really passive way where I just go home, say, Alexa, play Discover Weekly, and like that is my music basically listening experience completely. So I think that's kind of a very nifty kind of example where it's a little opaque. You don't have to know what's going on behind the scenes, but it really is this kind of like personalized listening experience. A more recent example, for those of you who use Gmail or Inbox, they've started to do these like kind of composed message responses, which at first I was like, this is completely pointless. I can type, sounds good, thanks. But it turns out, like, I feel like now I get sad when I don't see it. I'm like, oh, Google, you could have saved me like 3 seconds, which shows you, I guess, how far we are in like optimizing that flow. But I think it is actually a great example of kind of predictively getting ahead of what a consumer intent is, and then saving that little bit of friction, but multiplied, 50, 100 times a day, still winds up being something that's really valuable. So those are 2 examples off the top of my head.
Have you seen examples of machine learning gone wrong?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, with big companies, I think the place where that happens is usually when they feels like they're kind of like overcorrecting or like kind of pigeonholing you a little bit. I feel like for a while, Netflix had just decided that the only thing I want to watch was like really high-end food documentaries, which I do love. But I think I had to watch like Inside the Mind of a Chef, which if you haven't watched it, it's like David Chang plus kind of the Momofuku, his like creative vision quest, and Anthony Bourdain as a producer, amazing. And then I watched Chef's Table, like season 1 and season 2, and it probably took a year for Netflix to stop trying to put me down that path. So I think that's one good example. I think another is often with products that I think, I would say kind of like overpromise versus how confident they should be in the underlying data. So one of the things we used to say when I was at Google many years ago on the search side, a big kind of thing we used to talk about is like the prominence in the UI should match kind of the quality of the underlying data, the underlying prediction. And so you should be able to gracefully kind of express uncertainty in different ways. And I think a lot of companies, especially startups, you kind of want to show off a little bit and say like, look how amazing this recommendation is. And you're like, that makes absolutely no sense. I feel like OpenTable, I'm a little biased because I worked at Foursquare, but OpenTable is constantly like that. I'm like, why would you recommend that? Or even Google Maps today. Sorry, any Google people in the room, but when I type in food, the fact that it's ever showing me McDonald's is just like vastly dropping the ball on what they should be able to do. And they seem to be high confidence in it, opposed to expressing a little bit of uncertainty. So
that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that in terms of using the affordances of the product experience to represent your confidence in the recommendation.
Yeah, something that I think users, at the end of the day, when you're building whatever kind of software you're building, like the trust that you can build with users is obviously a huge part of it. And thinking about, being, reliable and then doing that over time. Doing that with something that is inherently unreliable, like making predictions, means that you have to be able to caveat in all these different ways, or be able to justify the recommendation so people can have a little bit of introspection. So if it's wrong, they know why it's wrong, instead of it just being something that's just a black box, and then you stop trusting the system entirely.
So today, for all of us here who read the articles about machine learning, or hear our engineering team members talk about machine learning, what would you say is the hype versus the reality of machine learning today?
The hype far exceeds the reality as just an opening statement, so I'm not going to be a huge booster up on stage here. I would say the reality is that in a few different categories of kind of, I'll call it like sensory recognition, so vision, natural language understanding, speech kind of transcription, translation, computers are getting to like maybe the intelligence of toddlers, I would say. They can like see a picture and be like, there's a cat, and there's a rainbow or something. They might be able to read a sentence and know that like there are a few important terms in it. But in terms of things that we kind of see, if you watch like Ex Machina or movies like that, I think that is far ahead of where we are today. often when people are talking about artificial intelligence, they're talking about it in terms of like what people call AGI, so kind of this general artificial intelligence where it's this prescient, like all-knowing agent. And any of you who ever have asked Alexa anything besides turn on the lights or like play the song, realize like how far we are. That's not to say there aren't a lot of valuable use cases, but I think when you think more about like applying machine learning to different product areas, thinking more about kind of more narrow applications that are within a particular domain, I think that's really kind of the sweet spot for where like technology is today and where you can improve kind of customer experiences.
I'm piecing together the fact that one thing I'm hearing you say is machine learning is really useful for a feature and improving in a feature.
Yeah.
But the first example that you came up with of a great usage of machine learning is actually a product.
Yeah.
When you were talking about playlists.
Right.
Discover Weekly.
Yeah, I guess, the spectrum between like when a feature turns into a whole product is a little bit murky. I think to me, whether it is a feature or product, I think kind of the key there is that like it's a constrained problem for a customer instead of this open-ended kind of problem space. So, I've played around with the Google Assistant, I think is what they call it now, which used to be like Google Now, which used to have some other name. And it is this open-ended kind of prompt of like, what do you want to know? And it's a voice interface. And I think the lack of constraints makes it really hard to do anything but constantly like disappoint you as a user. You keep trying to push the boundaries. I think Alexa, one of the smart things it's done is like, my mom loves Alexa. She's like, when it like got disconnected, she was like, "You have to come over. You have to fix it tonight." Like it's deeply saddening that like I don't know, like lost the Wi-Fi password or something. And when I asked her like, "What are you doing with it?" I mean, for her, she kind of realized it does a couple basic tasks well, but when you say something, it's like 99.5% of the time it'll understand what you're saying. It just only has a few narrow capabilities, and I think that's kind of the key with these types of products is. Really setting customer expectations of like what this can and can't do, and the ones I think that fail are the ones that really are just like unbounded, and then people just are constantly running to the edges and running into these paths where they just get disappointed inevitably.
So tell us about machine learning at Slack.
Yeah.
Given that all but 12 of us here are users.
Yep.
What are some examples that how Slack uses machine learning, either visible ones or invisible use cases?
So I would say, I mean, the biggest one obviously is in the context of search. So I think we announced this publicly, but if not, don't tweet it. We just passed over 100 billion messages in our kind of corpus, which at least back when I was at Google is bigger than the whole internet index that they used to index. Obviously, the internet's grown a bit since then, but it's this massive scale in terms of how much knowledge is flowing through the system. And we use machine learning within the context of search in a number of different ways. So understanding what you're actually searching for, understanding where you sit and what we think of as this work graph. So the people and channels and topics that you interact with, and implicit in that kind of behavior, we learn a lot about what are the things that you care about. So if you search for something like roadmap, the PMs on your team that you interact with versus maybe the sales team that's pitching something to customer meetings, like we'd probably want to bias towards the messages and files that they share as like a pretty trivial example. So we use a lot of that signal and models that we build around that to actually then predict what are the messages from that huge corpus that you'd want to read first. So that's on the search side. On the kind of more proactive side, and this frankly is where we've made much less progress, is trying to kind of tame this problem of information overload. So how do we take everything that's in Slack, and it can be completely overwhelming, and try to kind of narrow your focus a bit. So one of the things is in the sidebar and also in this view called all in reds, there's a thing we call scientific sort, which is kind of a hokey name. But the idea there is basically uses a model that we have built offline to predict, based on all your past Slack sessions, what are you going to want to read first from channels, people, et cetera. So it tries to reorder your sidebar or reorder all in reds based on your past kind of reading behavior. Again, that's like kind of a baby step towards something that's a little bit more ambitious, but that's one of the kind of instantiations. Another is trying to get really proactive about recommendations in the context of Slack. So for most folks, if you're at a big enough company, at Slack we have 1,400 people, about 8,000 public channels. So just figuring out what channel to be in is pretty difficult. IBM, which is one of our bigger customers, has about 150,000 active users and I don't know, something like 100,000 plus channels. So channel discovery is a huge problem. So we send you weekly recommendations about channels to join, using something very similar like Amazon or Netflix, so kind of collaborative filtering to channels that are very similar to the ones you're most active in, but you're not a member of yet. And we do that when you join a channel too. So if you join, maybe within Slack, you join the accounts-Nike channel, we might want to send you, hey, you might also want to be in the accounts-Adidas channel or the accounts-Under Armour channel. And that's all kind of using a representation of all the channels within your company. So yeah, those are a couple examples.
So what made Slack decide to get serious about machine learning?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if you...
And by the way, some context for that is not all of our companies here have decided to get serious.
Totally.
And there's pressure out there. We hear it's important, but when should we actually get serious about it?
Yeah, I mean, if you're an early stage company, if you just add powered by machine learning, you'll be able to increase your valuation by at least 30%. So I would just lock that in now if you're fundraising. And then if you throw in blockchain after that, I mean, who knows what you could raise at. So there's the hype, and the hype can be real, tangibly. But no, in all seriousness, I think Slack, the history there is, so I joined when the company was, I guess, a little over 2 years old, I want to say. And at that point, frankly, there was some companies that had been using it for at least 6 months, some 12 months, very few, 18 months. But you start to get to the point where there was enough of a history, there was enough of this archive that they were building in channels where you could start doing things that were a little bit interesting. And their expectations start to grow too, right? Because if you suddenly have, at that point, maybe 1 million messages in your company archive, the fact that you could basically, search was, you type in a word, it was an exact string match, and it was sorted by timestamp. You're like, well, this is kind of useless. What's the point of having 1,000 times much more information at my fingertips if I sort it by date? So I think the customer expectations are getting there, and the data that was available for us to use to do interesting things was there as well. But frankly, it's been a forward-looking bet. It's been something that we placed not out of absolute necessity, but because we wanted to eventually build to this punchline where organizations felt that they were more productive, that they could use the benefits of transparency in a way that was not possible before, and we wanted to make a kind of proactive investment in it. I think for a lot of companies, frankly, it can be a luxurious thing to apply, not a core thing to apply. But I think for businesses where you are your business is actually machines helping augment kind of human intelligence or making predictions, I think you kind of obviously have to think about it from day one. So I think it depends on the type of business you are.
So this is a product community. Many of the folks in the audience here are product managers. What should product managers think about when building data-driven products like this?
Yeah, I'm going to try not to do a very long version of that answer, but I would say a couple of things. So one is first off is demystify the whole thing. There's so many different buzzwords in this, and I think the basic idea of every product has software that powers it. A lot of them use algorithms. Algorithms are usually written by humans and are hand-tuned. At the most kind of simple abstraction, machine learning is just machines learning how to write their own algorithms in some way. So from how you interact with an engineering team or data science team, I think it's not really that different of a kind of partnership there. I think in terms of data-driven products in general, I'd say some of the key differences are, how does the UI provide a little bit more kind of buffer and a little bit more kind of guardrails for when it's going to be making predictions that are wrong. I think depending on the kind of team that you're building or product that you're building, designing loops into the product where naturally from how the customer is actually using it, there's this data exhaust that allows you to build up an interesting training set for some future task that you want to do. So, from my past experience, an easy example that was in Foursquare in the early days, it was really bad at guessing where you wanted to check in. So it had this kind of random list of places, but every time you click that check-in button, it was basically generating exactly the data set you want to be able to use to then train to do this proactively behind the scenes without someone ever checking in at all. So thinking about ways that you can build those kind of customer loops into the product in the early days that generates a data set that you can then train off for the future, I think that's something that's really valuable. I think, for Netflix, I'm sure before they were ever doing recommendations, they were collecting ratings. Turns out those ratings, when you have millions or tens of millions of them, wind up being a pretty useful thing to then train algorithms on to then predict future kind of watching behavior. So that's another big thing. And then
on that point, I remember when Uber started showing recommended places you might want to go based on the time of day.
Right.
And based on your geography, which is so helpful. Oh, you're at work, you usually go home now, or you're at home, you usually go to work now.
Totally. Using the Foursquare API actually as a quick plug. So I haven't worked in years though, so I'm only emotionally biased. But I think the other thing I would say is it can be really hard, I think, at a company that has never built machine or data-driven features before to kind of make that leap where you have a certain, and frankly, this was the case at Slack, right? Like Slack is this extremely manicured kind of product. It's designed, Stuart Butterfield is like the ultimate product founder CEO. And I think for the company, it was a really big kind of cultural change, actually, because we went from being able to say the software should be exactly the way it was crafted. The experience should be 100% what we had in mind to, some percentage of the time, we're going to kind of embarrass ourselves. And how do you kind of build that kind of cultural, acceptance of the fact that you are going to sometimes show things to users that you would otherwise be embarrassed by, but net it will be a good thing. And so I think they're talking about product strategy. One of the things that we have definitely done in Slack, and I've seen a lot of other successful companies do, is you really want to be able to incubate some of these more, experimental data-driven features. Some are a little bit more off to the side where it's not quite as prominent, where you can then validate and iterate over time and until you get enough confidence that it's now something that you feel like you can put more prominently in the core experience. So if you look at a lot of, especially on the consumer side, Instagram, Twitter, Foursquare, Spotify, et cetera, the main experience that exists today that's powered by data is something that they started doing off to the side, 5-6 years ago.
It was like in Canada or Australia back then.
Australia and Canada, and also like subtabs that you probably never interacted with, right? Twitter has this great example. They used to have this account called Magic Rex. I don't know, did you follow this back in the day? Only if you knew a Twitter employee would you ever have known about this thing, but it was this magical account that was some, I'm sure, hack day project where if you followed it, it would start sending you personalized recommendations as if it was a tweet from this account. So it was super hacky, but based on who you followed of interesting articles or breaking tweets that you want to see. And it was the first kind of foray they had into actually building kind of real-time personalized notifications that weren't just, so-and-so liked your tweet. But that was way off to the side, but a great kind of vehicle for them to actually learn and iterate till they could get enough confidence to make it more prominent. So I think kind of that kind of cultural change is actually one of the hardest things because it is kind of a little bit this leap of faith that you can start shipping something that at first looks much worse, but you have confidence that over time it'll actually be a much better experience.
That's really interesting that machine learning as a product means you have to give up some control over your experience with your users. And it might say something strange and you'll never know.
Yeah, well, hopefully you have a feedback button so you can be banned from saying it again, but yeah.
We've talked about machine learning as a focus for product managers. Are there any particular recommendations or thoughts for machine learning for designers?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think design, to me, I guess how you think about it from a design perspective and product perspective, they're pretty interrelated. I think on the design side, I view it, again, a lot about how do you give transparency into what's happening so it doesn't feel like a black box? How do you give kind of justifications or rationale for what's happening so that people have that context? And then how do you also give control to users so that they can be able to dial this down in different ways or dial it up in different ways? So I think thinking about that, it sounds conversational. I don't mean it in necessarily a conversational bot sense, but more in you're having this long ongoing dialogue with the user where you're trying to basically fine tune to their preferences. How do you make sure that they actually have, again, that transparency, that rationale, and that control? And how do you build that into the product experience so that feels pretty natural? So yeah, I think as a designer, it's not that different from other features you might build, but having that, and then also having a relationship with the engineering team so hey, if we could get a few kind of negative examples, that would be super valuable. How do you, again, kind of build the UI affordances to be able to collect that so the team can then build better recommendations over time?
So say we're following your guidance, we're going to use machine learning for more narrow cases where there's some training data, and we get started with more measured aspirations. Yeah. What are some of the most common mistakes that we're going to make when we start building ML products?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of mistakes you can make. I think one of the more common ones, I think, is that you can use a really bad training set. So that can be bad in a number of different ways. It could be really small, so you're extrapolating something that is not based on a real representative history. It can be biased, literally biased in the sense of either towards people or towards certain types of things in your system. I think there's a lot of different ways where training data itself can be kind of problematic. I think the other thing is often, again, that kind of confidence that you presented in the UI versus the actual confidence that you have in the underlying kind of system. And then I think also making sure that you have actual controls that people can use. So, a great example of this is, again, with more proactive recommendations. if you're sending someone a news topic because you're Google and someone searched for it once, but something they were searching for because it was something that was like disturbing to them, and you're now inferring that, oh, you want to get proactive like alerts about, I don't know, like the Supreme Court not upholding certain civil rights, like you're like, no, actually, please don't remind me more about that. Like there should be ways of muting, of hiding things, so that you don't get kind of push things that are actually kind of offensive or uninteresting to you.
There's a lot to think about there.
It's
a complicated
it's
topic.
a fraught area at times, yeah.
So say my company, my startup, cannot afford to hire a machine learning expert, a gazillion-dollar engineer who's an expert at this stuff with a PhD. Yeah. How might we get started?
Yeah, I mean, there are two really good factors playing in that person's favor. One is that the large cloud providers are frankly in this like incredible arms race to basically take all of these cutting edge research that they're doing and then exposing them as incredibly affordable APIs. So whether you're using Google's GCP or Amazon's AWS or Microsoft on Azure even has like a lot of really useful libraries for, I'd say, all the basics that you shouldn't ever be doing yourself. So like computer vision, transcription, translation, even some amount of natural language understanding. And then the other thing I would say, so that's on one hand, like just the public APIs that you can use for basic sensory recognition are just getting better and better, and there's no reason you would ever roll your own. The other thing I would say is just that I think even for engineers who don't have their PhD in machine learning or AI or something like that, there's so much information online and so many actually structured courses that even on our team in New York, we've definitely hired folks who are just like great engineers, are really interested in the space, have a bit of a math or stats kind of background, and then we kind of give them like a boot camp, which is not designed by us. It's just from the internet, like, hey, go take Andrew Ng's Coursera class, go look at this thing on Udacity, go read a couple of these kind of tutorials that exist and are interactive. I think if you have folks on your team who are just really interested, they can go from knowing nothing but have a lot of aptitude and interest to being productive, building a kind of narrow application in, I'd say 3 to 6 months maybe. So really like this is one of those areas where you hear all these crazy terms, and like it is true at the very cutting edge of research where you're trying to squeeze out like an extra % optimization, like you do need to have that kind of deep academic background, but for most practitioners, I think it's much more democratized than ever before.
Well, thank you for demystifying this for us.
Yeah.
Are there any machine learning heavy startups you're especially excited about?
Yeah, there's definitely a couple. I mean, it depends on what we define as startup these days, but one here that's in New York, and I met their CEO a couple months ago, which is probably most people haven't heard of. It's a company called InVision. Has anyone heard of this company? A few folks, okay.
I know that those folks, it's radiology.
Yeah.
Machine learning, computer vision for x-rays. Right?
Yeah, totally. It's this like incredibly mission-driven company. It came out of their own kind of experience with their family and kind of false positives that happen in oncology, but basically trying to take what the cutting edge is in computer vision, work with radiologists to actually see how they interpret these scans, and then try to figure out if computers can get at least as good, if not better, at a much lower cost, so you can democratize kind of access to world-class radiology, and doing that through applying kind of, again, like I said, kind of cutting-edge computer vision, and doing that in a way that works alongside radiologists. So it's a really interesting, to me, example of, well, one, it's obviously very mission-driven, but two, really thinking about kind of what feels like a narrow application, but a really high leverage one of having computers use past historical data to make predictions about an uncertain future in a more, I guess, capitalistic kind of lens. There's this company in San Francisco called Open Door, which isn't even available in New York, but they're trying to kind of, I guess, vertically integrate in the kind of home sale process and be able to, if you want to sell a house, normally it's like a 3, 6, 9 month kind of process. They want to be able to say, hey, you want to sell your house within 3 to 5 days, we can actually price it and actually buy it from you directly. And what they do there, they have this huge kind of data science and pricing team that is using all these different signals to basically try to figure out algorithmically, can they actually price a home they've never seen before? And they're able to do that pretty accurately, because if they did it inaccurately, they'd lose a ton of money. So it's, again, a kind of interesting example of a kind of narrow vertical, but where applying machine learning, having really interesting access to proprietary data is really valuable, and doing something that actually is changing an outcome in the physical world.
Your example of health, since we will always continue to get sick, and there's been a history of us getting sick, it sounds like an area, especially as we have more tracking on our watches and et cetera.
Totally.
That there's going to be much more and more interesting ML health-related stuff.
Yeah, and in New York, I mean, between Oscar and Flatiron at the larger end, and there's a lot of other kind of mid-sized companies I think are doing really interesting things in that space. So it's been great to see.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Noah, thank you so much. I think we're out of time. We're going to get to the next panel. I know you guys are excited to ask more questions. I think you're going to be around later to
I'll be around. Absolutely.
Everyone, please join me in giving Noah a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thanks.